I'm sure a lot of us that constantly work in .NET know to use Entity Framework when interacting with our database, but what if I told you there was a much better way in some scenarios? And if you're here, it's because using Dapper in your .NET API has piqued your curiosity. So let's create a .NET CRUD API that uses Dapper and will interact with our SQL database. But that's not all. As a bonus, fans of this channel know that in the past, I've wanted to know the best way to call stored procedures that return results from multiple tables through joins. And lucky for you guys, Dapper finally answered the question EF just couldn't. So make sure to not skip around in the video or you might miss something important. So now let's go ahead and create a .NET 7 CRUD API with Dapper, and then I'll show you how to call stored procedures using Dapper from that exact same API. Let's go. But before we get into the code, I want to explain a bit what is Dapper, because maybe you were researching alternatives to EF and this popped up, and I want you to not only have the code of how to do things, but understand what you are using. So what is Dapper? So Dapper is an open source object relational mapping library, or ORM, for .NET applications. It's available as a Nuget package and is an alternative to Entity Framework. It's focused on quickly accessing the database without a lot of code, and the queries are basically just SQL, so at least to me the learning curve is a lot less, especially if you have prior backend experience. You've probably worked with databases and writing SQL queries before, so I think that makes it a little bit easier than jumping in and having to learn everything that has to do with, Entity Framework and the way it does its queries. It's also lightweight and fast. With asynchronous support, you can also batch multiple queries together, and it supports parameterized queries for protection against SQL injection. And we'll see all the different ways that you handle parameters that are safe and protect against this type of attack. So we'll see that when we actually get to the code. It's also easily mappable to classes or models, but there are a lot of ways that you can interact with your database and retrieve results without you actually even needing a class or a model. You can just get dynamic objects back. So why should you use Dapper instead of Entity Framework? Well, Dapper is faster than EF because it directly uses SQL strings to make its queries, while EF turns its C# into SQL, just obviously adding more steps. It performs really well when you're requesting data. Dapper also doesn't need to know the schema of your database like Entity Framework does, allowing you to perform more complex queries like the ones that contain multiple joins, and we'll see that later when it comes to, just querying or also calling stored procedures. And if you really want, you can use both. They're not going to interfere with each other. But now let's get into the code. Now that we're on the code side, I've already gone ahead and created a brand new .NET 7 API, and I've added in a few things. I already created a models folder, and since I always do database first, I've already scaffolded in all the models for all the tables that we have in our database, as well as we also have, this DB context, though we're not going to be using it because we are using Dapper. But in talking about our tables in our database and all that stuff, let me show you guys the database that we're going to be using for this API. If you guys can see, we're using this sample database right here that has 3 tables: confederation, player, and teams. So as you can see, team ID, country name, confederation ID. Our player table has player ID, player name, team ID, and confederation has a confederation ID and confederation name. So those are the 3 tables, but we also have a bonus because I also wanted to show off something that I think is very nice with Dapper, and that's how it works with stored procedures, especially stored procedures that have joins in them. So we do have this one stored procedure called getPlayerInfo, and it should be right here. As you can see, it's going to select some information, very specific information, player ID from the player table and player name. Then it's going to go to the team table and get only the country name, and from the confederation table, only the confederation name. So it's going to obviously join twice and get on player ID. So we'll see a little bit later how Dapper works with that. But that is the database we're going to be using. So now let's move on and actually, set up Dapper within our API. And right before we get into the Nuget packages that we're going to need for this project, just wanted to say that the link to the GitHub repo for all the code that you're going to see here is going to be in the description. So check it out if you wanted to see the code a little bit closer up. So now, what are the Nuget packages that we're going to need to make Dapper work? Well, first of all, we're going to need Dapper. So search up Dapper, and it's this one, the one with the D logo with a ton of downloads. Install that. And the other Nuget package that we need is Microsoft.data.sql client. So go ahead and install that. And these are going to be the 2 Nuget packages that we need to make this project work. So like in most projects that I do, I try and follow the repository pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a controller for everything that we're going to do with Dapper. So I'm just going to call it Dapper controller and create that. And now that I've created my Dapper controller, I'm going to go actually ahead and create a few more folders that I'm going to need. So another folder that I'm going to create is going to be for my interfaces. And then another folder that I'm going to create is going to be for my repository. So I just want to have this as I'm going to be filling these folders out very soon. And now that I have these two folders for the repository pattern, I'm going to create one more, and it's just going to be for a custom model that we're going to need a little later on. So we're just going to call this folder custom models. So now we have our Dapper controller here. Let's actually start adding in the methods so that we can eventually, get to the repository and use Dapper. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to decorate this with its appropriate tag. So it's going to be an API controller, route to the controller. We're going to make it controller base. Next up, we're going to get rid of this because we don't need this. We're not doing views. We're just doing an API. We're going to need to create in a second our iDapper repository, and we're going to make that interface in a second. And next up, we're going to have our constructor for our controller, and we're going to be injecting that iDapper repository, which we'll create in a second. But now moving on to the actual endpoints within this controller, the first one up is going to be this get player. So the way we're going to be doing this, if I can just go back to our database. So we basically have players, and each player, in our case Neymar, is associated with a team or a country in this scenario. These are the countries or teams that we have, and then each country is a part of a confederation. So that's how we're going to be attacking it and pulling in data. So going back here, we're going to be passing in a player ID to obviously our HTTP get player. Coming down here, we have our repository, and we're going to have a method there called get player, and we're going to pass in that player ID, and then we're just going to get some type of information about that player, hopefully the information that we want, and then we're going to send it back, and that's all that we have here. Moving along, our next method is going to be, again, an HTTP get. This is going to be get players. This is basically going to get just a list of players, not a specific one. So we don't pass anything here and just call get players and get our information, and that's it. Next up is another HTTP get called get player info. But don't get this one confused with this get player, because this get player info, this will be the method that actually calls in the repository the stored procedure. So this one right here will be actually going and executing that stored procedure that I showed you guys that we had right here, this get player info, that if I bring it up. So this is obviously the get player info. This is what we're going to be executing from this one right here. So just keep an eye on that, and I'll explain obviously more about that once we actually get to the repository, but that's all that we have in here, passing in an ID into the stored procedure. Moving along, we're going to have an HTTP post. So here we're going to be creating a player or inserting a new player into the database. So we're going to be passing in the player object. And then that's just going to be passed into the create player method here. And that's all we're doing here. So let's move along. Next up, we have our HTTP put update player. We're just going to be taking, updated player information and passing it into the repository update player method and going along from there. And then finally, we're going to have our HTTP delete player, which obviously, as the name says, is going to take in some player information, specifically the player ID, and delete a player from the database. So now let's move along and actually create our interface for this so that we can get rid of this squiggly line. So going to my interfaces folder, I'm going to go here, create a new item, create a new interface, and I'm going to call it iDapper repository. And now that we've created this iDapper repository, I'm just going to go back here and just make sure to import it here so that we can have this kind of go away. But now obviously we're going to get squiggly lines here because we have not defined in our interface all the methods. So we're going to have to go back here and actually add in all the methods that we're going to do. And with that, we're just going to do this. So we've now defined our get players, get player, create player, update player, delete player, and get player info, which again, this one's the one that's the stored procedure. And we're going to have a custom model, which is for the custom models folder of custom player, but we'll get to that one in a second. But now that we have this, I want to go ahead and create the Dapper repository that will actually implement all these methods so we can start moving along and you guys can see how we actually use Dapper to do all of these things. So going to my repositories folder, right clicking it, going to new item, we're going to create a new class and it's going to be called the Dapper repository. Now that we've created our Dapper repository, let's actually start implementing all those methods that we defined in the interface. So first thing, we're going to need to pull in the iDapper repository. Now that we've pulled that in, obviously it's going to be like, hey, you should really, start implementing all my methods. But the first thing we're going to do here is actually we're going to be pulling in a few things. We're going to be pulling in a Dapper context, which let me explain in a second. I skipped over it on purpose because I wanted to explain it once we get to this point. Next thing, we're going to have our constructor here, and we're going to be injecting that Dapper context and setting it here. But now, obviously, like I said, this is a perfect time to explain this Dapper context, as well as we need to add this and this to our program.cs. So let me go back to our models folder. As some of you that might have been paying attention to the right side might have noticed, I have this Dapper context. This Dapper context essentially is basically just setting up the connection between, our context and our database. That's all it's really doing. It's the same thing that maybe the context does when it comes to entity framework that it does here, or that you set up in your program.cs here. The same thing that we're doing, but since we're specifically using Dapper, we want to have a specific context just for it. And this is how you could kind of use EF and Dapper if you wanted to. You just use a given context. But in our case, we're using this Dapper context. And with that being said, we need to go back to our program.cs and we actually need to add these in. So we need to add the iDapper repository to our services. So we're going to do that. And then we're also going to add in a singleton of our Dapper context here. And now that we have this, we're all good to go with these services. Now let's keep implementing all the methods that we need to. So the first method that's up is going to be actually create a player. And I actually have some comments as well in my method, just because there's a lot of different variations with how you can handle Dapper. And I wanted to just give some points, ideas, things that maybe I didn't implement, but I know you can do, and I just want to note them down. So in case you might have a certain scenario where you need a little bit more, need a little bit less, need some type of different thing, I just wanted to show you guys that there are different examples and that the one way that I'm doing it isn't the only way, and there's more complicated ways, and there's just a lot of different variations to Dapper. It's not as strict as maybe Entity Framework is, which I actually really like. So what we're doing here is we're opening a connection. So again, using that Dapper repository context, that context that we defined right here. And then what we're doing here is we're doing execute async. And then this is what I mentioned earlier when I was going through the slides. You're essentially just writing SQL statements. So for someone that maybe doesn't have a ton of C# or .NET experience, or doesn't really want to get into the whole like learning entity framework, if you've done SQL before, this is going to look pretty familiar to you. And then all you really have to do, if you want to do it, you can just do this, do kind of these dynamic parameters in here, and then obviously define them correctly and they get inserted into here. And you're good. And this is also, again, safe against SQL injection, so you don't need to worry about that. But then another way, and I guess maybe could be the more recommended way in Dapper, is to use dynamic parameters, and I will use them in another one of these methods, but I just wanted to show the example here. And it's basically you can use dynamic parameters, assign them here as player ID, and then you would pass this parameters in here instead of this, and then it would fill these in that way. And since you're creating here, execute async only returns affected rows. So obviously, if I'm inserting one new player, then I would get a 1. But if I want to assure that maybe I created the correct player, you could set an output parameter and then go and receive that back by going and pulling this variable, this ID. So that's a way you could confirm. You could also just call a get players here right after this to then check, is my new player there, or check the count, did the count go up, or something of that nature. Or you could just be content with affected rows, but just wanted to give you guys some options for how you could proceed with that using Dapper. But that is another way that you can do parameters if you need to, specifically this one for output and getting values back once you do a create, since execute async does not return anything more than just the affected rows. And moving right along, we now have the delete player, which kind of has the exact same structure as create. Again, it's going to execute async. Again, another SQL statement, delete from player, where player ID, and we're passing in that ID. Again, you could also do this dynamic parameters if you really wanted to, but you don't have to. This one's just simple when you're just passing in one thing. And then again, it's just going to return affected rows, and you could do the same thing of checking, did something get deleted, and you could do an extra call or whatever you feel comfortable doing, or you can just pass in affected rows. So our next method is going to be a little bit different, but actually really fun. We're going to have our get players method. This one's going to grab player information or a list of player information, but not only just from player, we're actually also going to pull from team. So we're going to be doing a select from player, and then we're joining on team ID. So we not only want information from this player table, also from team. So we're doing a join. And what changes here? So first of all, if you've noticed, when it's delete, also create, and the other one's put, which we haven't gotten to, you want to use execute async. And all those are always going to return affected rows. When you actually want to query the database and get results, you want to use the query async or its many variations, because there's a lot of them. There's query first, query async, obviously the not async ones, and all of that. And there are different ways to do this as well. In this case, we want to actually use our models here, and it will map it one-to-one. So you want to make sure that there's no weird like spell or capitalization errors. But in this case, you actually have to do something a little tricky and funny. And this is why I'm saying on this certain example, maybe Entity Framework would be a little bit easier to just do a dot include versus having to do this syntax, because it's a little bit weird to understand. But basically, since you want to tell it, hey, we need to include from the player table and the team table, when you do a query async, you pass in your two, and then you're going to have kind of the initial model that you're starting from. And then when you get to this backside, you need to say player and team. And then you're essentially saying, we're going to match this information. So we need to make sure that these two are equal, because this is the secondary table that you're going to through the join. And then you're making sure that you include the team information in there. And then you're going to return the player. And that's how you return the player with the team information inside of it. I hope that made sense. And then you also have to tell it what you're splitting on. So since we're splitting on team ID, we have to make sure that we say team ID. And I have seen that if you had a second join, you could add in another table here. Like you could add confederation if you wanted to, but it would just change how you do this. And the syntax gets a little wild. So in this scenario, maybe a dot include would be better, but that's up to you guys. I just want to show you guys the options when it comes to how you would handle a join when you're just getting a list of information. And there are ways that you can do and just query the database without needing to give it models, and it'll just give you dynamic objects, and we'll see that in a second. Moving along to our next method, it's going to be the get player. So this specifically is going to be just getting one player. This is the one that I think was the first method that we had up here. Yeah. So we are just passing in an ID, going to our database, and we're just doing a select from player where player ID. So we're just only going to this table, and that's it. So we just would really want, like this information right here. That's all we're doing. Nothing crazier than that. But I wanted to show you guys, again, different ways of doing dynamic parameters. So you can also create a dictionary, as we see here. You could create a dictionary like this of string and an object. And then you pass that into the dynamic parameters. And then that would also go in here. Or you can do what I said earlier in the previous example. And that is just creating a dynamic parameter here. And then passing in the player ID with the ID. And then that parameter just goes into here. So again, just more different ways of doing this. Like I said, you can do it this way. You can do it this way right here. You can create a dictionary. You can just do it this way. A lot of different ways that you can go ahead and do parameters, but all of them are safe. And you just want to make sure that you're not just like doing kind of, plus parameter, obviously without that, you just don't want to be doing that, because then that is scary and you could have SQL injection as a mistake in your application. So just don't do that. But any of these are just different options that I want to present to you guys so that you know. And in this case, we are doing query first async because we just want that first result. And we are passing in this player model. But like I was saying, you can actually remove this model and then you just get a dynamic object. So as you see, we're just getting a dynamic object here, and then we could map it or do whatever we wanted, or just say we're getting dynamic. But if it's, so straightforward, we could just create a custom model for it, or we could just, use the model that we're using for the table because we have it, right? But if it was a more complicated object, such as like a stored procedure, wink, wink, we could just use a dynamic and not have to worry about it, especially if it was maybe like a bunch of joins or a massive object. We could do something like that. But again, options, and I'm glad that Dapper gives us these options. Moving right along, we're going to have this update player method. So we're again going to get a player information that's probably changed somewhat. And all we're doing again is, like I said, for the delete and for the create, we're again doing execute async. So we're only going to get the affected rows. We're going to be doing an update player, set the player name because we're only updating the player name here, where obviously, the ID is equal to the ID. And we're just passing in our parameters as such, as we've seen. Nothing too crazy, nothing different here. And again, you could query to make sure that you are getting your player updated correctly, or you could make some type of, make this player name an output variable and get that value back to make sure and compare, or something of that nature. And finally, we've got to probably my favorite method and probably one of the question marks that I've had for so long since the last video I made about stored procedures, and that is my get player info method. So as you can see, we're going to have that custom player model, which I'm about to go ahead and create. But let me walk through what's going on in here before we go ahead and create that model. So in the get player info, we're getting this ID, again, the player ID. We're creating our connection. We're saying the name of the stored procedure, get player info. If you guys remember, that is the name of our stored procedure down here. Let me bring it up again. The name of our stored procedure, which takes an int, which takes this int as a value. Going back here, we're setting our dynamic parameter as ID. And then we're going to do await connection, query first async, passing in our custom player model. And then we're passing in our procedure name, the parameters, and then we're setting the command type to stored procedure so that Dapper knows that we're calling a stored procedure here. So before we do anything else, let me go ahead and create this custom player model. So going over here to the custom models folder, just going to create a class, and it's going to be that custom player. Now that I've gone ahead and created my custom player model, this is all that's going to be in there. We're going to have a player ID, player name, country name, and confederation name. And as you guys can remember, these two are coming from the player table. This is coming from the team table. This is coming from the confederation table. We have two joins in here. And if we go back here, you guys can see we have two joins in here and we're selecting specific values. So for that to be kind of a nice object that we're just receiving, I just wanted to do a custom player. But again, you can just remove this and all you're going to do is get a dynamic object and then you have to, kind of map it. So it's just a little bit more difficult to work with, but you could get away with it and it would be just fine. And you wouldn't have to worry about mapping it to some table or your DB context like, Entity Framework does. And this was such a frustration for me whenever I was trying to do this exact thing in Entity Framework. The fact that Dapper even gives me options and is so just easy to work with and nice. This actually made me very happy when it came to Dapper. And this is why I would use this over Entity Framework in this exact scenario if I just had to call a stored procedure that was very maybe complicated or part of some legacy thing that I couldn't change. I would just rather do it this way. But now putting my custom player model back, and now that we have this, this is all we have to do. We get our value back and it's going to be automatically mapped to custom player, and we're calling our stored procedure this way. And now we're going to have one final method that was not in our interface, but I wanted to include it just so that you guys know that you can do this. And we're going to have one more method, and this one's more for educational purposes. I'm not really going to demo this, but just wanted to show you guys that you can do this in Dapper. And for any of you that maybe want a really hands-on control of the transactions and when you commit, or if you want to actually have to, roll back whatever happened, you can do it in this way. You obviously have your connection. You do this begin transaction. And then, you do your queries, blah, 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 blah. And then once you're done, or once everything goes well, then you actually call this .commit. If this .commit doesn't get to here, then all those transactions are rolled back and nothing actually happens. So this is just a way you guys can control that. If any of you guys were curious or wanted to know how to do that, this is an example here. But now that we've done this, I now have all the methods that I need for this. I think I just have to go back here and actually bring in this custom player model. But now that we have this, I believe we should have nothing left. And now we can go ahead and I can actually show you guys Dapper working. But right before I demo, if you guys are finding this video helpful, please remember to drop a like on this video so I can spread to more developers on YouTube. Thank you. Now that we have our API running, let's actually demo all these endpoints. So the first one I'm going to do is get player. So I've gone ahead and put a breakpoint right here so we can just kind of see how it hits and then get that value back. So let's actually do get player. We're going to do get player 1 because right now in our database, all we have, I think, is Neymar in here. So yeah, we're only going to have one player. So we're just going to do ID 1 and execute. We're going to see that ID come in. We're going to set our dynamic parameter. And if we go in here, we should see our parameters inside of here. We have 1 and it's this player ID. Stepping forward, that player ID is going to be set in here because we're setting in our parameters into this. And then stepping forward, we should see that we're getting an object back of player model because we actually gave it a model. And we should see that we're getting our values back. Stepping forward, we should see that we're getting that Neymar object. And obviously, no team information, just this because we only passed in player and we also didn't join or anything. So now let's move on to the next one. Our next one's actually going to be get players. So this is just going to be that list players that we want. So that is going to be this one. And this is the one that actually uses a join and uses this fun, creative way of using both models in here. So I'm again going to put a breakpoint right here. And I'm again just going to press execute because we're just getting anything. So going through here, we obviously don't have any IDs or anything. But as you guys can see, we need to make sure that we're setting our team equal to team. And like, hey, we need team information. So stepping through, we can see that we have one player properly with our model. We have the player information, but then we also see that we are getting our team information inside of here. And we open that up and we're getting everything from the team table. Which again, for any of those that don't remember, has team ID, country name, and confederation ID. And if we go back, we should see that we are getting in here our team information. So confederation ID, country name, and team ID for our player. So we're getting all that information back. Let's step through. And we see that we are getting all our information plus all the team information. And that is all because we actually passed in, the models as we needed and then set this here and told it what to split on, which was team ID. And like I said, you can do another join if you wanted to. It just gets a little complicated. But now let's move on to our next endpoint. And this was my favorite one, the one that excited me the most when I started working. And that is going to be our get player info. So now that we have our get player info here, I'm actually going to scroll down to the bottom to our stored procedure. So this is the one that actually was the stored procedure. And we are going to call it, again, passing in just a 1. So we get our 1 through. We're going to get player info, again, is the name of the stored procedure that we're calling, which again has 2 joins in it. We're again going to set our parameters in here. Step through. We have our custom player model, which has, these fields that are from the player table, team table, confederation table. So going back to our repository, we're going to step through. Our result should be one custom player that is getting data from all of them, just like the stored procedure, wrote it up, or I wrote it up in the past. And then we're getting that information here, all super nice and super clean. But now let's start moving on to the create a player. So now we're at our create a player. I went ahead and already put a breakpoint here. We're actually going to create, I think, Mbappe. And then I believe France is team 1. Let me just go confirm. Yes, team 1. So we need to put that in there for its player. And then we don't care about player ID because that's going to be created once it goes in here. So we're going to step through, execute. We're going to need that player information. So as you can see, we're getting 0, Mbappe, that team ID. That team ID is going to be set here. And the player name is going to be set in here. And we should see that if we go through, we should get an affected row of 1. Before we even return the result, I should be able to go back here, execute this again. We see that we now have another player in here. And if we go through, we should see that I correctly get a 1 because I'm just returning the affected rows. But again, you could, get this as an output variable, or you could just call your players again, check, oh, do I have another one? Or, affected rows could be good enough as well. So now that we have actually 2 players in our database, we can go ahead and update one of them. So what I want to do is I actually want to update Mbappe to be Benzema. So for that, I'm just going to edit all of this because I don't need all of this information. I really just need this. And then this player ID is going to be 3 because I believe that's the one that he is. Yes. So now going ahead, we're going to execute this once I just put a breakpoint wherever this may be. Here it is. Now let's hit it. Going through, we see that our players coming through, 3 and Benzema. And then we step through this and we should see 1 row affected. Step all the way through. And we're again going to return a 1. Let me clear this. But going back to our database, refresh this, and we have now been able to edit it successfully. And now finally, we are going to move along to our delete. Sadly, we're going to have to now delete him. And to do that, we are just going to pass in this player ID. So that is going to be player ID 3. Let me go to delete here. Where are you? Here we are. Do that. Now let's execute. We're going to get 1 ID going through. Set our ID here. Go all the way through. And we should see that we also get a 1 because 1 row was affected. And this is now back to just Neymar by himself. And that is it, guys. That is how you use Dapper to create a CRUD.NET 7 API. That's how you do a get an individual player, get a list of players, create, update, and delete. And even as a bonus, I threw in the ability of how to call stored procedures that actually have joins, which is something, a little bit more complicated than just calling, one table of information. Joining from multiple tables is a reality, and sometimes we have very complicated queries that for a reason are put as stored procedures, and knowing how to call them from our API is very important, and I'm glad that Dapper gives us a really cool way to be able to do that. And now you have a CRUD API and can interact with your SQL database whenever you want. But how about we secure your API so not just anyone can use it? So if you want to learn how to do that with JSON Web Tokens, watch this video right here.